This episode is sponsored by PAX, the gold standard in emergency response bags. So when you're working under pressure, you need kit to be both dependable, tough and intuitive, and that's exactly what you get with PAX. Every bag is handcrafted by expert tailors who understand the demands of pre-hospital care, from the high-tech, skin-friendly and environmentally responsible materials to the cutting-edge welding process that reduces seams and makes cleaning easier. PAX absolutely puts performance first. They've partnered with 3M to make perfect reflective surfaces for better visibility, and bright grey interior makes finding kit effortless and fast, even in low light. With over 200 designs, PAX bags are made to suit your role, your needs and your environment. And thanks to their modular system, many bags work seamlessly together, no matter the setup. PAX doesn't chase trends, their designs stay consistent, so once you know one, you know them all. And if your bag ever takes a beating, their in-house repair team will bring it back to life. PAX are built to perform, made to last. Learn more at pax.bags.com or head to the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're looking at grief and bereavement in pre-hospital care. So over the years, we've tackled some of the most technically challenging aspects of pre-hospital medicine, that of major trauma, cardiac arrest, critical care interventions. But alongside these clinical encounters sits something deeper, which touches every patient's life, every family, every healthcare professional at some point in their lives, that of grief. So as you're going to hear in these episodes, it doesn't always necessarily occur after death. It can start with the loss of health, identity, relationships, independence, or future plans. So firstly, you're going to hear from Julia Samuel, who is a psychotherapist, author, and founder, patron of Child Bereavement UK. Julia spent more than 3 decades supporting bereaved families and helping people understand how grief shapes our lives. So in this conversation, Caroline Phillips, one of the co-hosts on the podcast, explores with Julia the process of bereavement, some of the challenges of breaking bad news, but also the impact of repeated exposure on healthcare professionals, and also the importance of developing resilience and continuing care compassionately for others. Then we're joined by grief specialist and psychotherapist Liz Gleeson for a 2-part exploration into grief. We look at some of the models, some of the empirical research, and indeed some of the grief training and grief literacy that Liz teaches on a day-to-day basis. We also look at some of the practical skills such as listening, presence, cultural awareness, and supporting people during those moments of vulnerability. So these conversations are thoughtful and compassionate. They're deeply relevant to everyone working in pre-hospital care. It was really challenging actually editing these conversations because everything seemed and feels like it's important to add, but I tried to edit it down to an hour so that we just get some of the salient points and indeed take home points for listeners. Do go away and listen to the individual episodes. I'll put them in the show notes so you can deep dive in your own time. But they are fundamental because there is a real lack of grief training and grief literacy, and I'm included in that number. So it really is on us to understand grief more. So I hope you take something from these conversations. They are wide-ranging. We look at suicide, bereavement, family estrangement, divorce, perinatal loss, anticipatory grief, and lots of other topics throughout the 3 episodes. And yeah, it's not a light conversation, but it's a necessary one because we all have to interact with grief at some point. So it's prudent to tackle it really before it tackles us. Okay, I do hope you get something from these episodes, and we'll speak to you again on Monday.
Well, 2 things. One is that you need to not conflate the feeling with the fact that you feel a failure or you feel bad or you feel like you've done it wrong with the fact that you've done it the best you possibly can and that this is a terrible situation and that you need to hold both aspects side by side but not put them together. Yeah. And the other thing is to have some training like this or understanding like this so that the more you can have confidence in a situation where you feel very frightened, and you will always feel frightened, some basic knowledge, which I hope will get across today, that will support you to be able to show your humanity. Yeah. Because probably the single biggest thing that matters isn't the exact words. People always want the exact words. It isn't exactly what you say. It's much more how you connect with them and how you show it, that you show your humanity and your compassion. And the difficulty with paramedics is everything is so fast. It's like A&E, and when everything is accelerated, your capacity to connect with someone is narrowed because you're always thinking of what you need to be doing, what, treatment you need to be giving. And around death, once death has happened, we need to slow down so that you can connect with yourself, to enable you to connect with the family of this person that's died.
And I think also on that point as well, Julia, it's so perhaps a little, in some ways, trickier for us as well, because we've never met the patient or the relatives or whoever is on scene before. Usually it's very unlikely that we have done. So I guess in a way that makes it harder to connect, but perhaps that takes off a little bit of maybe the pain that we might feel in terms of delivering any news as such, because we haven't had that relationship with the patient and the family before.
Well, I agree it is very different when you don't know someone. But if you think of the kind of incidents in your own lives where someone has just been, who you've never met before, has shown kindness, that you're on a tube and you're upset and someone passes you a tissue, or, I had it in a hospital where I was having anaesthetic and a nurse gave me a particularly kind look just before I was anaesthetised. It's those small acts of kindness, of humanity that people remember. And that connection, you don't need to know them. And like you say, in some ways, not having a huge loss yourself, although you can't not be affected by it. Being with someone in the presence of their dying, when you're in the job to try and save their life, it will send your whole system on alert, and it does. And you then think of all the protocols that you have to do and what you should be doing, and then when it fails and they die, that is, you will feel it bodily. I don't know what happens with you or the people listening, but most people feel it like fear in their bodies, or they get frozen in their bodies. But their whole autonomic nervous system goes on alert. It's heightened. And that is what kind of, when you're on alert like that to some extent, your capacity to think and cognate and connect goes offline, because when you're on fight or flight, which you are when you're working, it's a different operating system to be able to communicate effectively. Does that make sense? Because you need to slow down.
Yes.
In order to connect, you need to slow down. And so, one of the techniques I give people is, you don't have to do it so that they can see you, but take 5 long breaths, before you speak. So take a big breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. Breathe in for 5, hold for 5, and out for 5 is a good one. But that may be asking too much. But just even a few long breaths enable you. And there's no hurry. The person has died. The emergency is done. So I think there's this sense of urgency all the time when you're a paramedic and in A&E. So the big thing, first of all, is to slow down. What's interesting from what you're saying, and will be true, I think, of everybody listening, is that you have as much video-like recall of many of the times that you broke bad news as the families do. And so I could see in your face that you went back to the place it was, and you can remember so much about it. Of course, you've done it a long time now, so you won't remember everyone, but you'll remember a lot of them, and they live in you, those experiences. And they do also influence your next event that happens. And we'll talk about how you debrief yourself so that you kind of come to a new event clean, as it were. The experience of grief, that at that moment the person has died, the task of grief, and the process is mourning, the process of grieving is mourning, is to find a way of living with and facing the reality of the death. And that's the task. And that doesn't mean that you live with the reality and you kind of put it behind you and you forget about it. It's finding a way of accommodating this new piece of reality that your mother has died, your brother has died, or in the terrible cases, your child has died. And pain is the agent of change. Pain is the thing that forces us to face this new reality that we don't want to be true. And it's often the things that we do to block the pain that do us harm. But at the moment of the death, we need as much data and memory as possible for that pain to come back to us in our memories, for then us to adjust to this new process of mourning. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
When people aren't present in the ambulance, say when they're following in a car and the person dies in an ambulance, every piece of the jigsaw that's missing, everything they didn't see, can haunt them and preoccupy them. So as much as we may want to protect people from witnessing a death, actually seeing it and seeing its limits is better than imagining it, because our imagination is limitless and grotesque. And however bad the truth is, we can find a way of living with and facing the reality of the death. Kübler-Ross's phases and stages of mourning is the most well-known. The theory that I think is more helpful is the dual process, someone by Dr. Strobe and Shute. And what they talk about is that at the moment of the loss, whatever the loss is, we have an instinctive drive to mourn, to feel the loss, to feel the pain, to express our grief, to remember, to be numb, to cut off, do all the things that we do with grieving, and a drive to be restorative, to get on with life, to survive, to go forward and kind of be okay and have a break from the pain. And I think the process of grieving, in that facing this new reality, is the process of oscillating between the loss and restoration. So that if you give yourself opportunities to remember, and it's how we remember that we grieve, it's not by forgetting, touchstones to memory. And because the love for the person never dies. And I think for you in the ambulance with people to remember that when the person has died, the people around them loved them as much, maybe even more than when they were alive. So everything that you do to them, how you touch their hand, how you pick them up, how you handle them, how you talk to them, how you are with them, they will feel very sensitive towards. Yeah. And, there'd be many instances when I sort of won't go into, where families have been incredibly distressed of what's happened to the bodies of family members. And I think often clinicians thought, well, they've died. But actually, the love never dies. So that's an important thing to remember. But the oscillation in the theory is the movement between loss and restoration, giving yourself a break from grief, going for an exercise, going to take exercise, being with a friend, going for a walk, anything that kind of gives you a release from the pain. Then you go back and you focus on it. And over that time, you incrementally adjust to this new normal, this new landscape that you didn't want. The other person whose theory is good is William Worden. And his tasks fit within that loss and restoration, which is to face the reality of the loss, that this is the truth, to find a way of adjusting to this new reality and living with it, accepting it, to begin to reframe your life given that this has happened to you, kind of finding a way of living with it. And in the last one is to live again and love again, that you, in the accommodation, that person is always there, but they're not front of mind. And so you have more energy to kind of live again, love again, and engage in your life. If that makes sense?
It does. Yes, thank you.
And I think for the paramedic perspective, the thing to think about every time you have a death with you, whether it's in an ambulance on the side of the road or in the house of the family, whatever it is that family is very unique. And I think one of the things that professionals often do is overestimate what you should be able to make a difference to. So if you look at what the impact is on the family, what makes a difference to the family, it will be their relationship with the person who's died. It will be their previous history of losses or not losses. It will be the predicting outcome for how they survive and thrive or not after death is the support they get at the time and after the death. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that influences is the circumstances of the death. Yeah. So, a sudden and unexpected death. I don't think there's a hierarchy in death, because even an expected death, you've been told that your husband has cancer, he's got 6 months to live and he dies in his 5th month. There's a way that it is always unexpected when somebody dies. It is always a shock when they die. But of course, there has been more of an opportunity to talk, to have opportunities, to have different conversations. And so often what people talk about is sudden and traumatic death, and particularly with child death, when it's a death out of time, a death that shouldn't happen in our kind of understanding of life, is that it's grief with the volume turned up. So all the normal experiences of grief, of feeling angry, numb, sad, furious, confused, lost, or mourned, all those different feelings people have. With sudden and traumatic death, that's intensified. Mm-hmm. Being present and witnessing the death, like supporting the family by your presence. Never underestimate the importance of that. That you may not remember their face, but you'll probably remember the circumstances, but they will remember everything about you, what you're wearing, the colour of your socks. They'll remember every word. They have, this is the worst experience of their life, or certainly one of them, even if it's their grandmother that's died, that was kind of, is a natural death. So they have video like recall of it, and part of their mourning is to be able to go back and replay it, because that, as we said, is the process of grieving. The things that injure them on the whole to avoid is anything that tries to kind of make it better, in quotes, that in some way they feel you're diminishing their experience. So, those old kind of cliches of she's gone to a better place, or how many children have you got if a child died, as if having other children would make it better. Or so the sort of 3 touchstones that I think everybody who is a paramedic will have, because you wouldn't be in this profession, but to let yourselves know that you have them and have the confidence to have them, is first of all your humanity, that you're there because you care about people. So show your humanity, let yourself feel it and let them feel it. And it's often not with words, it's by how you look, it's how you kind of sit with them. Listening is probably your greatest tool, that you do need to communicate, and we'll talk a bit more about that, but you don't have to say very much. It's much more checking what they understand, what they need, and responding to them. And listen with your whole being, kind of slow down again, breathe, listen with your eyes. 70% of communication is nonverbal. Listen to the content of what they're saying. Don't assume what you've heard, which people often do. You're so busy answering what they've said, you don't hear it. And listen with your heart. So listen with your compassion, and kind of recognize that everybody's different. They'll be very influenced by their culture. So that will influence their response. But also everyone has a default response in a crisis. So some people shut down, some people yell, some people will pray, some people hit things. I mean, you'll have seen all of those things. But not to judge them, but to be empathic, and that none of us know how we would react in similar circumstances. So to listen to them, to be empathic, and to respond to their needs. So that if you think you're putting data in their memory, that they will go back, and this makes it worse for you, I guess, but they will go back and they'll play it hundreds of times. So that's what matters. I think what people need at the time is they need the truth. So although this sounds a bit bonkers, when the person has died, I would turn to the family and check with them before you speak to them. Do you understand that your mother has died? And they will say yes. And then I would so often there's a thing of you're the professional and with your knowledge and your training of what you do, and so you're that expert. They're the expert on themselves, on their culture, their family, their relationship with this person, and you communicate expert to expert as equals. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does.
So you communicate to them and saying that your mum, the sentence that you can say is, "I'm so sorry to tell you," as you would have seen your mother, brother, child. If you know their name, use their name. So don't call the family the mum, the dad. Ask them what they want to be called. Don't call the person. Call them their name, because that feels like they're subjective, not objective.
Yeah.
Has died. And all you have to say is, "I'm so sorry, so-and-so has died." Leave some space. You don't have to jump in with lots of words. I think by the end of your communicating, you need to say what is likely to happen next. We're heading to the mortuary, we're heading to the hospital, we're heading to the hospice, wherever it is. When we get there, da-da-da, so that you say what is likely to happen. All the time, check their understanding, because people's capacity to listen and take in what you say goes offline when they're devastated. So can I just check you've understood me? And they say yes, but often they'll say something that's completely different. They were in la la land. So then most of the litigation of complaints, it's often not that the information wasn't communicated, it was that it wasn't heard. If you see what I mean. So it wasn't transmitted. And most clinicians think they communicate much better than they do. Because they're understanding what they're saying. So, like I said at the beginning, probably the biggest thing you can do is listen, but also speak slowly. The tone of so when people speak very fast like this, it's very hard to take it in, and also your compassion completely gets drained out. So when you speak slowly, you come across much more empathic. You have more emotional bandwidth for them to connect to, and they will trust you. And that's the thing you want to leave them with, that I trusted that professional. I felt like I was in good hands. I felt like they knew what they were doing. I felt they really cared for my child, mother, sister, brother. I felt like they really looked after me. That's the feeling that you want. And ask them what questions they have. Do you understand why they died? Well, you may not know. I mean, that may have to be from a post-mortem, but then you'd have to say, we don't know how he died. So give them as much information as you have, because, again, what they don't know, they make up and it haunts them. And give them time. I mean, it's different for you in that you're kind of on a route and you get somewhere and it has its own trajectory and time span. But certainly in hospitals, and I don't know if it would be true, is the thing that stops families getting most what they need is the speed, is not giving the families time. Time to make memories, time to say goodbye, time to be with their child or their parent or whatever it is, because that is the data they live off. If you think between now and the funeral is the only time they're going to have with that person ever again in their life. So every decision they make and everything that you do is the only opportunity they're going to have to do that. So that you want the thing that derails a grieving process is regrets. I wish I'd put him in his football strip. I wish I'd held his hand. I wish I'd kissed him. I wish I'd spent more time with him. I had a client yesterday whose child died as an adult in a different country, and she was so shocked when she saw him in the mortuary. She can't remember his face because she did stay there, but she was still so much in shock. There's so little that she can remember. Yeah. And a professional may have said to her, remember, you can come back. You was only spent however long that was. Maybe in a few days you want to come back, because you'll probably want to recall it. I actually always suggest they take photographs. So again, the more data that you have, that's that piece of reality that you're not haunted by. I think self-compassion, that to give yourselves the kindness and the respect and the value that you would other people. That I think doing very tough jobs, you can be under so much kind of distress to kind of fix things that you often have what I call a shitty committee, and you have this horrible little critical voice in your head.
Yeah.
So if you can develop a practice of being aware of what is going on in your head, but most of all, kind of be self-compassionate. There's Kristin Neff has done a great TED Talks and videos, and she's got a little sort of exercise of self-compassion where you breathe and you put your hand on your chest and you go, and if something's really painful, you go, oh, that was really hard. And then you kind of are kind to yourself, and then you move your attention away. So it takes like 2 or 3 minutes. But giving yourself little pockets of self-compassion, I think, will enable you to transmit more compassion, but also be more resilient. Because, you do not want to kind of wreck your own life saving other people's lives.
Yeah.
Well, Elizabeth Kübler-Ross did amazing work in the area of dying and death. She actually developed these stages for people who were dying, that when they learned that they had a terminal illness, they went through different emotions, including denial and bargaining and anger, but not necessarily all of them and not in any prescriptive way. And then some other person decided this was applicable to grief, but actually it is not a theory that we use at all. There's absolutely zero evidence for stages model of grieving. It suggests that grief is linear, that we have different emotions to go through and then we're done. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we know that nothing could be further from the truth. So stages model is outdated. There's no evidence for it, and it's a myth, which is perpetuated in literature and Hollywood, but actually it has no place in contemporary grief theories. Grief and grieving are two different things. So grief is an emotion or a cluster of emotions that we feel throughout our lives, from the beginning we're born to the moment we die. Every time we have a loss, there will be an element of grief that surfaces for us. The grieving process, however, is a much more complex process that we go through, usually after a significant loss. And it's a process of, I suppose, accepting the reality of the death, which can take a long time. This is Worden's process, and Worden's model. I'm going to just start with this one and then come back to the dual process. Worden's model suggests that we need to first accept the reality of the loss. This can take 6, 12, 18 months, and it's a neurological process that we go through where we are remapping the world without our deceased loved one. So knowing that they've died and actually fully accepting that this is real, this is a new reality, are two separate processes, okay? Once we accept the reality of a loss, we're much more likely to feel the pain of grief. So if we're in denial or protesting the reality of the loss, it's kind of kicking grief or the pain of grief down the road. Worden suggests that we also then have to adapt to life without the deceased and get used to a world that they no longer exist in physically. And then eventually at some stage, we begin to reinvest in life. We begin to go, oh, you know what, I might book that holiday. I might join the gym this year. We start to find meaning and purpose again in the world. But these are not stages, and they're in no particular order, and not everybody goes through them. But more or less, that's an umbrella for the grieving process, if you like. And I think it's really quite accurate. Within that then, grieving, so feeling the pain of grief, this is where the dual process model can come in. When we are grieving, we are not in a perpetual state of loss and deep grief. We oscillate in and out of it. So we might be feeling the pain of loss, be very much in loss orientation, in the depths of despair. And then an hour later or a couple of hours later, we might be addressing our bills, organizing a funeral, making dinner because the kids still need to be fed. So we're not so in the loss orientation, we're more trying to restore, in restoration. Restoration is not easy. It's not a break from grief. It also involves quite an amount of labor to keep pushing forward. But dual process essentially means that we are facing our loss, feeling the pain of grief, and then we're pushing forward, making the dinner, maybe organizing to see somebody on Friday, and then we're back in loss, and then we're back in restoration. So it's this oscillation back and forth between loss orientation and restoration orientation, which helps us to integrate the loss. So, you see someone at the coffee machine laughing and their father died last week. They're laughing in this minute, but in another half an hour, they may be under the heavy burden of loss. And it's really important for us to know that we're in and out of it all the time. We feel we can really cope and we're dealing quite well one minute, and the next minute we can be on our knees. So that's what the dual process is highlighting, this process of grieving in and out of loss and restoration.
Let's move on and look at attachment theory, Liz, if that's okay, and just how attachment theory informs our understanding of sudden loss.
Yeah, sure. I mean, attachment is fundamental to understanding grief responses. The people that we were more attached to were likely to have a much bigger severance or feel a much bigger severance when they die. I mean, our whole system is built to attach. It's how the species survives. And essentially, grief is a protest to being removed from that person that we're attached to. So, this is another deep biological and neurological process that is going on under the surface. Bowlby and Parks actually first recognized attachment and its relation to grief when they were working with bereaved parents, and they noticed that often the responses of bereaved parents to their deceased loved one was like a young child. If you can imagine a young 2-year-old suddenly being removed from their parent, the distress is immense. And that is attachment theory, playing out in front of our eyes. And it doesn't matter if we're 40 or 80 or 60, if we're attached to somebody and they die, it is like an amputation. Some part of us has been removed, and somebody that we love dearly has been removed. And our initial response to that is to protest, to cry, to grieve, to demand their return in a way. And it's only when we fully accept the reality of the loss that protest behavior begins to abate, and we start to grieve more, if you like. But we do know, from my clinical practice, people who are really securely attached and who have internalized a lot of love tend to fare a little bit better than those people who struggle, who've, more insecure attachment styles. We can think, they weren't very close to their parents, so they must be okay. But actually, that's not always the case. We can really struggle with abandonment and regret and remorse, if that attachment bond has been not the best or not the most secure or not the most loving. So attachment plays a huge role in how we understand an individual's response to loss. It tells us what this person meant to them. And it's so much about just being fully present, isn't it? Like literally putting our own experience, our own feelings to the side. I think a lot of us make the mistake of feeling like we need to make it better, or we need to have something clever to say, or we need to have a solution, or we need to be able to offer advice. But all that serves in doing is shutting the person down. I had a supervisor once who used to say, show up and shut up. And, there's a lot of truth in that. There's a lot of wisdom in that. Can we just show up, bear their grief alongside them? I would say it's not just passive listening. It's not just being there and saying nothing. Sometimes it's extending a hand onto a back. It's fully showing up with the intention of empathizing, of trying to understand what this is like for this person, and also with compassion, which is a desire to alleviate their suffering, not fix it, but simply showing up, bearing witness, showing them that their grief isn't too much for you. That is compassion, because that alleviates suffering, that eases suffering rather than exacerbates it. The minute we try to fix, advise, or come up with solutions, or, yeah, I know how you feel, my auntie died, and, the minute we bring ourselves in, we've ceased to show up fully for that other person. There is nothing like the gift of actually leaning forward and being fully present to someone in that moment. It's a good question, and I think it's always different, and it's different for different situations. If someone has just experienced a profound loss, for example, a loved one has just died by suicide, and they're sitting there and they're being tended to, the way I'm going to show up for that person is very physical. It's very physical. Their body's in immense distress. Their prefrontal cortex is shut down. They're in survival mode. I'm going to show up with my calm presence, with my steady body, with my eyes, with my breath, with maybe my hand on their back. I'm going to acknowledge this is really, really difficult. And I'm probably going to offer them a little bit of hope. I know you're going to survive this, because in that moment they're wondering, how will I ever survive this? I'm going to offer them just a little bit of hope. You will survive this. I know this doesn't feel like it now. Trust me, you will survive this. We've got you. So it's almost existential holding at that point, and it's very physical. I'm not going to drown them out with words or reflecting back anything, because the chances are their body is just like a hare caught in the headlights of a car about to knock them down. So my quality of presence and the way I listen in that moment is going to be very different to how I might listen 6 months down the line, where, their prefrontal cortex is starting to come back online, and they're trying to make sense or make meaning of things, then the quality of how I listen will be maybe quite different. Tell me more about that. What did they mean to you? Who was he? How was that for you? That sounds really difficult. So it's still very much all about their process. 18 months, 2 years down the line, it might be quite different again, where there might be a lot more psychoeducation or reflecting back, or really diving into how their ongoing understanding of loss and grief might be inhibiting them from adjusting to the world again. So there isn't just one answer to that question, Owen. It's reading the situation, what is needed right now, and knowing that what is needed in 2 days might be quite different, and what's needed in a week might be different again. There is nothing worse than the people who've done active listening courses, and they're putting that in practice, because that's telling me that they are just trying to pull out their tools and do the right thing, as opposed to just sitting there and showing up fully with their body. It's not about us when we're showing up for someone else. So all the time we're reading this particular situation, what is needed right now? Not what did I learn in that course?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, listen, absolutely. And to your point, actually, I realized in the acute stages of grief, you said this around the prefrontal cortex, actually, they can barely remember their own name. And actually, it's so visceral, and it just is so emotive and takes over their whole body. Actually, you're right, just presencing, just being present, but also not giving them complex information, or indeed maybe even any information they can't assimilate, can't process, but just, you're right, being there, getting them to sit down, maybe a cup of tea, and like you said, just physically, that physical presence as well. And you're right, because I think absolutely there's no cognition, there's no conscious cognition, because it's just overwhelming.
We do need to acknowledge what's happened. Like, this is devastating. This is devastating. I'm so sorry this has happened. So we need to acknowledge what's happened, and we need to validate their emotional response. Of course you're feeling this way. Of course you're feeling this way. We have support and help for this down the line. Right now, you just need to breathe. Right now, you just need to get to your next breath, and then your next breath.
Absolutely, and the time horizon really narrows. And a guest said this actually on a different podcast, was around, especially with either pediatric death or acute illness, it's 10-minute slots. It's like, I'll tell you what's going to happen in the next 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, and the time horizon narrows. But just, it's maybe all they can process is the next 10 minutes, the next 2 minutes. Liz, let's pivot slightly and look at exposure, because one of the aspects of grief is that if there is continual exposure for paramedics or pre-hospital staff, the highly emotive situations on a daily and or weekly basis, one of the things I struggled with really as a critical care paramedic was the exposure to grief on a daily basis, and very different facets and types of grief, but grief nonetheless. Could I get you to really just unpack just that, how we avoid or indeed navigate burnout, or indeed those emotional boundaries when there's a high frequency of exposure to grief?
And you know what? I think those emotional boundaries might be the problem. Paramedics are human. We are moved, and it's okay to be moved. My understanding from burnout is it's not working too hard or using your body too much. It's not being able to complete emotional cycles. So you go into a difficult situation, you have an emotional response, and then poof, I have to put in a professional boundary. And where does that emotion go to? Now, I spoke with a beautiful man during the summer. He's a paramedic, a firefighter. And he told me about, a really difficult situation that he was in with his colleagues. And he said they came out, and at the back of his van, his colleague was bent over, holding the back of the van, crying and talking about what he had just witnessed and gone through. He's the least likely to experience burnout because he's allowing the emotion move through him. He's expressing it. He's talking about it. That was tough. He's completing the emotional cycle. I think we need to create space for that. There is no such thing. It's a concept, it's a construct of we need to keep these boundaries and keep it together. I am moved to tears at times, sometimes when I'm with people and they're telling a deeply moving encounter as something that's happened to them, their loved ones. And I actually think it can be really useful for the client to see the loss and the grief reflected in somebody's eyes. But I'm really clear that the emotion that's being moved in me is because of their story and their experience and my empathy and compassion. It's not because of my stuff that's unprocessed. There's a huge difference there. So I think, to answer your question in two simple parts, we need to know our own shit, if I could use that expression. We need to understand our own grief, and we need to deal with that somewhere else that's not in the workplace, so that when we are being moved, it's not our stuff that's being moved. We are genuinely being moved by somebody else's experience because we are human. And that is a biological, neurological response that we have. Our mirror neurons are activated when we see somebody in intense distress, and we can feel it as if it's our own, That is normal, that is natural. And as long as the emotion is fully connected with the present experience and not our past experience that are unresolved, I think we're okay to be moved. And I think that avoids burnout. Yeah, so disenfranchised grief is a term that was coined by Dr. Kenneth Doka For losses that aren't really acknowledged by society, therefore the grief becomes disenfranchised or unacknowledged, unsupported. We would have seen this in times gone by, certainly with LGBT couples, where one partner would die and the surviving partner would not get the acknowledgement of their loss or the validation of their emotions, and the grief would have become disenfranchised. Or, for example, what if your ex-husband dies? Do you get any support then? If you've been divorced 10 years, he doesn't matter anymore, but you had 30 years prior to that and 4 children, so the grief of an ex-partner can often be disenfranchised. Or in the case such as miscarriage, where maybe nobody knows that the woman was pregnant, and therefore the loss is unacknowledged and the grief again is disenfranchised. So there's many losses that are not apparent or not recognized by society, and therefore the grief can become disenfranchised. Or even the case of sibling loss, the amount of siblings who desperately grieve their deceased sibling, yet people say, "How's your mum? How's your dad doing now?" As if the sibling's grief didn't matter or doesn't matter. So grief can be disenfranchised in many ways. Or also the way that someone has died. They died from a drug overdose, or they died by suicide. I don't know what to say about that. They're really difficult topics. So I'm going to say nothing at all. And in doing so, I am disenfranchising the grief again. Grieving starts the moment we know that our life is going to change irrevocably because our loved one has a terminal illness or a life-altering condition, chronic illness. Life as we know it is going to be different, and therefore there's a change, and therefore there's grief, We also, and a lot of people I think often feel really ashamed of this or feel guilty for grieving while somebody's still alive. But essentially it's exactly in the term, anticipating a death, anticipating what they're going to lose, and feeling the pain of that and imagining what that might be like. But also I don't think it's ever really just anticipatory grief. It's also ongoing losses. Like when someone has a terminal illness, let's say someone is diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, which is terminal and can't be treated. Not only am I grieving their potential death or their probable death in the future, but I'm also grieving the life I used to have where my biggest problem was who's walking the dog next Monday. I might be grieving the loss of assumptions about the future, that we're going to grow old to die. We're going to grow old together. I might be grieving the retirement that I thought we were going to have, and now it doesn't look like that's going to happen. I might be grieving the loss of my sex life, because now that my partner is terminally ill, that might be off the table. I'm grieving the stable, secure life that I knew. So it's not just anticipating their death. There's a lot of loss in the anticipation of someone's death. Older people and grief, there's so much myths around that. We think because people reach a certain age, they've experienced a lot of grief in their life, therefore they're able for this. Or they were expecting it because, they're 90 or they're 80. It's not the case at all. It's not the case at all. Losing somebody you love at any age, particularly a spouse who you love, it's like an amputation, It's like an amputation, and you don't heal from that, and you don't get over that. You have to learn to live with that, but it can be incredibly difficult for both genders, especially if the person who is deceased was the one who paid the bills or took care of things, male or female. But it is a myth to think that older people do death better than younger people. And I suppose when you're older as well, there's more social factors that can impact how you're grieving as well. You probably have a smaller social circle. Maybe mobility issues mean you're not able to go out and engage with your community. Therefore, there's less people acknowledging the loss, less people validating the emotions, less people providing support. Now, we're not great in our society with older people in general, never mind at times of bereavement. And many people that I've supported, of an older age, just talk about the immense loneliness. Even if they do go out or make social efforts, if you like, coming back to the empty house at night, or the weekends tend to be really difficult. Like, people are happy to meet up for lunch during the week, but their weekend is for their families. And so there's a lot of older people who are enduring weekends, getting through them. But I think loneliness is by far the biggest issue for older people, as well as our assumptions that they can handle grief better.
Let's just start with parental bereavement. Is in a way, I guess, one of the most complex forms of grief. I unfortunately, and I'm sure many other support providers have had to deal with parental bereavement in extremely difficult, challenging circumstances, horrendous circumstances involving suicide, death by suicide. Could I get you to speak to really how we, I guess, in a way, deal with these cases as sensitively as possible in such a visceral and tragic moment?
More humanity, and even more humanity. I think it can be shocking for people attending the scene. And again, like I said before, how we show up really matters. I spoke with Fiona Toomey, who's the founder of HUG, a suicide bereavement charity here in Ireland. And Fiona's daughter Millie was very young when she died by suicide. She was 11. But Fiona talks about the absence, the tumbleweed in the house, like how even for the police liaison officer, it was too much, that people were not able to bear this immense loss or get their heads around it. And so the absence of people, in supportive roles was visceral, like they were so alone. I remember Fiona saying, I thought the cavalry would come if something like this happened. But there we were left sitting alone, with our heads spinning, and people were afraid to approach them because of the super sensitive nature, of their child's death. So, back to, can you show up? Can you be of service? Can you be that person who's not scared to knock on that door and sit down with that mother? Can you be the one who could bear this pain alongside them? Even if you don't know what to say, even if you don't know what to do, like any other situation, a hand on the back, a cup of tea, not running or being absent, which will all exacerbate the process for people, but truly showing up and maybe following up also. Just again, a profound humanity. But I think really the difference here is there's a tangible fear among attending people that it's so sensitive, they're going to get it wrong, do more harm, or they can't bear it themselves. So maybe we need to run through that in our heads about, how am I going to deal with these situations when they occur, not if they occur, when they occur.
Yeah, indeed. And they are never easy. And there's never, to your earlier point on the other podcast, there's never one formula. There's never one answer. It's actually deeply human. And also through the longevity of time, it's absolutely, as you said, time to stop the stop clock and not worry about the next job or indeed the next incident. It's what this patient or indeed what this family member needs right now, and an enduring sense of that. Let's look at perinatal loss. This is a really heavy conversation, but to your point, needs to happen because also to your point, these circumstances, if you're in pre-hospital care for long enough, will happen, and you will have to engage with these incidents. And also, to your point, it's better and it's prudent to have education to engage ahead of time and think about how you will react and enact in this situation rather than be reactive. So let's just talk about perinatal loss and, such as stillbirth or miscarriage, and dealing in compassion and with compassion, navigating these intense emotions from parents in real time. Could I get you just to unpack your thoughts around that?
Yeah, and just also to say there's also termination for medical reasons as well, and abortion and sudden infant death shortly after the birth. So there's many reasons why a baby might not make it to term or might die around the time of birth. I'm not an expert in this area. There is an in-depth training in this on the Shapes of Grief program with a bereavement midwife, Brenda Casey. But perinatal loss is another one of those losses that's, the grief is often disenfranchised. It's we don't want to go there. We don't want to talk about it. We're afraid of making it worse. Like, as Brenda says, it's the ultimate paradox, death before birth. And it's incredibly sad. It's a shattering of all the assumptions we have about the future and our future as a parent or our future as that child's parent, and all the dreams we concoct and, the hopes we have for them. It's, again, very visceral, particularly, people who are pregnant and going through all those physical implications of losing a baby, losing a pregnancy, losing a baby in and around the time of birth. And again, we need to fact find. We can't make assumptions. For some people, they're able to deal with pregnancy loss quite pragmatically. And for others, it's absolutely devastating because they've been 8 years trying, So every situation is different. And again, compassion, kindness. We never say things like, you'll have more. Do you have more? Well, that's okay then, We do tend to say, how many weeks were you? As if the number is going to determine how much compassion we'll give them. If it was 7 weeks, we'll give them a bit of compassion. If it was 23 weeks, we'll give them a bit more for that, These are questions that shouldn't be asked. Again, it's very physical. It's a very physical experience. So a physical supportive response is essential. And absolutely grief training. Understand what this might mean, understand how to use empathy rather than sympathy. Never minimize the loss by saying, at least you can get pregnant, or, you've 2 other children that need you. Any way we sort of try and silver line a situation, we're actually minimizing the loss and further isolating the bereaved person. If life isn't about giving each other a hand up, I don't know what it's about. Rocking up with compassion and care and being of service to other people. That makes me sound like Mother Teresa, and believe me, I'm not. But I think, there is a response we have in our bodies, which is a caregiver response. So some people, and I wish I knew more about this actually, when we have a stress, when something triggers a stress response, we've all heard of fight, flight, or freeze. Well, fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. But there's also another response, which is a caregiver response, where we're moved to alleviate somebody's suffering. So this is the response a firefighter might have when they plunge into a house on flames, or the person that runs towards the road traffic accident rather than stands freezing at the side. I know my response is a caregiver response. I generally spring into action if I feel that there's something I can do. That's the key. We tend to freeze if we don't know what to do or feel that we've nothing to offer. But if we feel we can make a difference, we have this impulse to alleviate. And that's really important to know. Like, we are hardwired, many of us, to alleviate suffering and to support others. And we need to remember that that's our job, literally. That is literally our job, to move towards the suffering, to move towards the pain, and be there as a scaffolding for somebody whose foundation has just crumbled beneath them.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.